Okay, so yes, a little bit about me first. So hello, good morning to you. I mean, this is good night for me. As soon as I get off this, I'm going straight to bed. But it's really exciting to be here and speak to a different group of people today. As we've said, I work for Cambridge Maths, which I will explain a little bit about in some of what I'm talking about today. Before that, and really importantly, I was a maths teacher for a number of years in a secondary school. And then I left teaching because I got the opportunity to do something extremely exciting, which was to actually work for Enrich and Underground Maths. So I spent a number of years working with them, and you may have heard of those projects, you may use some of their resources. That was a wonderful time for me. And then unfortunately, when Underground Maths came to a close, I moved on and started working with Cambridge Maths. So they're all very closely related projects, but they do slightly different things. And so I've had quite a good experience in this world. I've been very lucky moving project to project, lots of different things that I've been able to work on, lots of different types of age, stage, resource types, curriculum types that I've been able to have a little bit of a part of. And I'm also lucky enough to be a parent now as well. So I'm seeing a lot of the things that I've been researching and reading about actually sort of starting to emerge in my two small children, which is also fascinating and feeds into a lot of what I find curious and interesting about what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm hoping that some of that comes through in what we're talking about today, and that you sort of know where I'm coming from, where I'm speaking from, the perspective that I'm bringing to this, and I hope that you're able to enjoy some of that too. So the very first thing that I would like us to do today is to think about a question. And it's this question here. To make sure I give you a little bit of time to think about this, I'm going to read it out loud. So, what was the most common answer to this question among students aged 6 to 12 years? And the question is 8 plus 4 equals something plus 5. So I'm asking you to predict or to think or to guess. What do you think the most common answer to that question was? Now I can see people typing it into the chat. And that's great because, yeah, it's a really interesting selection of numbers coming up. Lots of 12s, but some other numbers too. We've got a 17, we've got a 9. Oh, we've got some 7s. Interesting. A moment more to decide if you haven't already. You certainly don't have to share, so make sure you've just made a decision for yourself. Okay, so the answer to the question I'm asking, but not the correct answer to the question, of course, is 12. Now, obviously, this is me saying the most common, means I've got that information from somewhere. So actually, this is from a particular piece of research. And in this study, they found that the most common answer to this question was 12. Now, a lot of you predicted 12, and I wonder why. I wonder if you sort of anticipated the types of misconceptions that might arise. Maybe you've seen this in your own students. I certainly found this really interesting when I read this particular piece of research, and this stuck with me for quite some time because I don't think I quite anticipated the level of misconception around this kind of format of question. So I found this quite interesting. Now, we're not going to focus on the question itself right now. What we're going to focus on is thinking about the research, the source, where I've got this information from and why we should consider it, think about it, and whether we should take anything from that, or whether this 12 is in fact essentially meaningless. It's one person's experience. How do we know that? Well, we might think about the reliability of it. we might think, okay, I've read this piece of research, it says this thing, that's really interesting, but can I rely on that? Well, what makes it reliable? Well, there's lots of different things. This particular study was a single study, but it was relatively large. So 752 students, that feels pretty big. And it's worth saying that having looked at the literature, there are other studies that have found similar results. So I feel, from my point of view, having looked at this and done a bit of looking around here, that I'm fairly confident this is something that requires a bit of attention. So what are the implications here? I've read a piece of research, I found something interesting in there. I've decided it's worth considering, worth thinking about a little bit more. But what could possibly be the implications for me, for teachers, for anyone else? And there's lots of implications that we could take from this. One that we've sort of summarized here is that teaching the equal sign as a purely operational thing seems to perpetuate this misconception. Now, that implication is written in a little bit of a sort of academic research papery kind of speak, and is actually one of the parts of the discussion of this paper. So it's sort of an implication that's raised within there that we're taking on board. But what does it mean? Well, teaching the equal sign as purely operational, that's the bit that's wordy. It's possibly something I don't think before I started getting really into understanding the language of research papers, I don't think I'd have known what that meant. You might be able to predict what it means based on certainly those of you who predicted the number 12. Essentially what it means is that students are reading from left to right, and they are seeing the equal sign as a signal to compute something. It is a command. So this is saying to me, I need to do 8, I need to add 4, and then equals, that means I need to work out what 8 plus 4 is. And they don't consider anything to the right because that comes later. So perhaps there's a sort of implication here that they'll write down the 12, and then actually they may even continue, add the 5, and get a final result of 17, which I know some of you suggested. So purely operational means only thinking about it as a signal to compute something. And that's quite interesting because it is often portrayed in that way. It's the way calculators work. It's the way that makes a lot of sense. It's very simple to understand when we first start writing down symbols and equations. So it says a lot to me. It said a lot to me as a teacher. It made me think, hang on, did I really think about this? Did I actually talk about this with my students? Did I make an effort to do anything to sort of resolve this? And that's what's interesting here. And that's what I want to sort of emphasize with what we're talking about today, that the research that's out there, there's a lot of really interesting things that we can pick from it, but we have to engage with it in a way that's not just reading it and taking it as written and expecting it to provide us with answers. What's better for us is actually to be reading it, finding something that we think, yeah, actually, isn't that interesting? Isn't that fascinating? Making some kind of judgment about whether we think that's a reliable source of information, and being able to decide what the implications are for us about that. And some of those implications might be talked about in the paper itself. And sometimes they're not really. Sometimes that's for us to come up with. And that's what makes it hard sometimes to get much from a research paper, is that we have to do a lot of work. And as teachers, certainly when I was teaching, I didn't do that work. I didn't really engage in this way. I'm lucky enough now to be in a position where I have been, but I don't think I was before. And that's an interesting reflection for me. So we're going to come back to this particular question in a little bit, but what I'd like to do now is just to rein it back in, right back to Cambridge Maths itself, because I introduced myself as working for Cambridge Maths. This session is about learning a bit about what Cambridge Maths is, what we do, anything that might be of interest to support you. So I'm going to start with the really broad and particularly unhelpful, I'm going to say straight out, top level aims of Cambridge Maths. Now, these are really interesting and they are great when you're talking to certain audiences. But honestly, if I was a teacher reading these, I'd be asking immediately, okay, that's all very well, but what does this actually mean? What have you got to say that's useful to me today? So I'm not going to linger too long on here, but I'm just going to draw attention to a couple of words within these aims, because this is what's really at the heart of what we do in Cambridge Maths. So within that first one, we are concerned with maths education, and we are particularly concerned with investigating, thinking about connectedness within maths. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean really thinking about how mathematical topics are connected together, really trying to think about ways of redesigning how maths might look for students and learners to really emphasize connections and coherence amongst those ideas. We all know how frustrating it is when we know one topic is related to another, but we're teaching them 6 months apart. And actually, those kind of ideas, that's what we are thinking about in very broad terms. And the second point is important for the context of today. We aim to make the use of the best available research and evidence. So everything that we do starts from the position of looking at what research is out there. And we go through this process that I've sort of summarized a little bit in the previous slide of looking at it, trying to find interesting things that are useful for thinking about what maths looks like for learners, attention to this connectedness idea, and then using that to build anything else, any resources, anything else that we do. So actually now attending to the point of what does this mean in practice? What detail is this? Well, what I can talk to you about in a little bit more detail is what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think this might be a useful starting point. So I've mentioned already, I read a lot of papers. This is my job. So a lot of what I do is reading. I read research papers, I read books, I read around particular topics. So I have a focus, maybe it's a particular idea or a particular topic, and I look, I search, I dig out all the things I can get access to, and I read them. And one of the most important bits of that, and the time-consuming part of that, is I have to try and synthesize it all. I'm not reading them to take individual messages from individual papers. I'm reading them to get a sense of what's out there, the landscape around that idea, to try and sort of saturate myself in what's being said, and to try and distill that into some key messages around that topic. That's something that takes time. It takes a certain amount of familiarity with the material. And so it's something that we've built up. We've worked on this project for a number of years now. And as writers, there's a number of us, and we all spend a lot of time doing this because you have to be a little bit familiar with the language, the layout, and what's out there. And we make judgments, therefore, about the relevance of it, the validity, and we take these top messages and we start to communicate them. So how do we communicate them? Well, the first thing we do, I acknowledge you're not going to be able to read what's on here, that's not important. The first thing we do is we actually write research summaries ourselves. Now, when I say a research summary, this is the closest thing perhaps to an academic document, maybe, that I'm describing. So we synthesize everything into a written document. And that's mainly for internal use. When we're working with people who are designing curricula and things like that, these are a way of us saying, this is the research that we've read, this is what it says, and this is what it could mean. So we do that. But in order to write those, we actually also draw a lot of pictures. And I've explicitly focused on this point because this is really, really important to me in the process of engaging with research, is actually drawing pictures. And that might sound a little bit odd, but it's part of this whole making sense of it, engaging with it actively and critically. Papers say things all over the place. You know, maybe I've read 15 papers on a topic. I need to be able to make sense of some things. And sometimes they're saying the same thing in slightly different ways. Maybe you've got slightly different perspectives. And I find I'm all the time trying to distill that into a picture to make sense of it. And this is something that's quite powerful for me. And I know a number of my colleagues use a similar technique. We try and build images that we're going to use instead of words. We all know the power of using a picture, but even just the creation of the picture is extremely important for actually being able to bring together what you're reading and make sense of it and take something from it. And then once we've done a lot of that process, what we do is we actually build something. Now, this is what the Cambridge Maths Framework is most well known for with the people we work with at the moment. And that is not a necessarily well-known thing, but we build something called the Cambridge Maths Framework. And essentially, this is a map of mathematics, but it's not a curriculum. It's not attached or associated with a particular country or a particular jurisdiction or a particular age range. This is attempting to be just a map of mathematical concepts and ideas and the ways in which they are connected together that is grounded in the research that we have read and synthesized. So it's meant to be informed by that research base, not informed by what's going on currently in a particular context. And that's where we're slightly different from some other curriculum-based projects. And the span of us is also quite wide. We're aiming to be working all the way from age 3 all the way to what might be reasonable to expect pre-university. So 18, 19-year-olds to be experiencing in a meaningful way. Now, this is exciting, but not much of this is visible to the public at the moment. And that's where it gets a bit interesting for you, because some of this is sort of soon starting to become more and more visible. But there's actually a job to be done before the wider public, and in particular before teachers, see it all. There is a certain amount of needing to think really carefully about how we present this information. One option is just to put it all out there. But that's not necessarily much better than just saying, go and read all the research papers. There's actually a role we can play to actually do some of the work here to help pull out some of the biggest messages, perhaps some of the most powerful messages, to make those easier to get hold of, easier to interpret, easier for you to engage with, as a starting point, to open up that conversation, open up that option to start engaging with the research in a meaningful way. And so we've started working, and we have been working on a number of different things. And that's what I'd like to talk for the remaining time about. Now, the first thing then, moving on from here, is related to this question that we started with. Now, this question we started with, I revealed the answer, I revealed the source of that, but now I've introduced a picture, in fact, an infographic. So this is a picture that is designed to be communicating information. And this is, in fact, the full information, the full data set from this particular research study. So this isn't just the answer to my original question. This isn't just what was the most common answer. This is actually all of the results. Now, I wonder, as you look at this, what you notice. Deliberately just taking my time over this because there's a lot to notice in this, and there's a lot of interesting things. Maybe you want to type something in the chat. Maybe you notice something that you think is surprising. Maybe you notice something that you just think is interesting. Maybe there's a question that this makes you want to ask, something you want to know. See some things coming in. Yeah, right. No grade 6 student got that question right. Isn't that interesting? Why on earth did that happen? Yeah, the shape of that pattern, the peak in grade 3. That's interesting too. this there a moment longer because there's a lot to see. Yeah. Why did so many grade 6 students think the answer was 12? It's a very good question, right? Certainly for me, I think this raises a lot of questions. I think I'm looking at it thinking, what happens? What's different about the focus in year 6 or grade 6, sorry? You know, grade 1, maybe I would understand that because they probably haven't met this type of equation very much. So I'd perhaps expect them to not get it right. But at grade 6, is there something about the focus of that year? I mean, I know in the UK, year 6 is where actually the teaching does shift a little bit in nature because they have some high stakes assessments at the end of year 6. And so if this was representing UK data, I might, if I was being skeptical, I might suspect that maybe this got missed because there was so much focus on things that were coming up in that particular assessment. Maybe this sort of got overlooked. But this isn't UK data, so I don't know that for sure. But yeah, it's really interesting, and it raises some questions that make me reflect on how I taught, and hopefully make you think, I wonder what it is here. Why is this such a pervasive problem? I mean, even where they are getting it correct, the proportion is so small. This is quite significant. So the reason I've gone back to this is because what I was saying was that we do a lot of work that we think is really interesting and important, but you can't see it. But what we're trying to do is to build things that you can see. And this particular image is taken from something that we do publish and that is freely available to everybody, and teachers in particular. It is designed for teachers. And the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that at the bottom of the screen, there's actually a link to it. It's something called an espresso. Now, an espresso is a document. It is a 2-page document that is designed to do these particular things. It considers one particular issue, each one, just one issue in maths education. Now, sometimes that's a topic. Sometimes it's a pedagogical issue. Sometimes it's a wider teaching issue. There's quite a variety of them now. And they are published on our website. And they are aiming to do these things. They're aiming to summarize the research around this thing so that they are quick and easy to digest, easy to just glance at and take something from. They're trying to draw out some of the classroom implications, but as a starting point, not as a just read this and then do it, just as a sort of thoughtful point. And with this overall aim of just trying to give access to a slightly smaller pool of what that research is, because there's so much out there, and a lot of it says useful things, and a lot of it takes a lot of effort to get to. So it's trying to do that work, a little bit of it, just to start that process. So for those of you who haven't seen an espresso, or as a reminder for those who have, what does an espresso look like? So this is why I focused on that question and with the infographic image, because the infographic is actually a really important component of the espresso. It's something that we design. It is not something that is taken directly from the research. It's something that we build that sometimes communicates a particular study or result, like the one I showed you, and sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's a question type or a particular way of thinking that we design as an image, so that this isn't just 2 pages of writing, because that's not necessarily any better than, again, directing you just to some research and saying, read it. It's trying to give you different ways of taking some messages, taking some thoughtful points from what's out there. And so those are my favorite parts of them, I have to say. They're the favorite part to build, and they're the favorite part to read for me. And if you only ever look and engage with the infographic, you'll be getting a lot. So I would certainly at this point urge you to go to our website, have a little browse, look at what's there, and have a play around, even if it's just looking at the pictures. And before we move away from the idea of an espresso, I do have one more of those questions, just because, again, something interesting, just to finish up with in terms of espresso. So this one is associated with the idea of remote learning, digital learning. So this is a fairly recent espresso that we wrote. And the question that came from a research paper that was looked at for it is this one. What proportion of 53 maths education apps reviewed were focused on drill and practice? Some percentages arriving in the chat, pretty high. Now, I will say, just bear in mind here, there's no judgment on whether drill and practice is a good thing or not at this point. We're just asking the question. What proportion were focused on this idea of drill and practice? Oh, we've got a big range. We've got lots up at the 190, and then we had one down at 20. Interesting. I mean, a lot of this will depend on what you've seen out there and how you've engaged with it, of course. The answer for this particular study was 74%. So actually, it's fairly high up there. For some people, I think this might be surprisingly high. For some, it's probably a little bit lower than they expect. The source of that information was this particular study. And again, asking ourselves the question, okay, reliability. Well, this is one that's quite interesting. This is why I've included this one. It's a single study, which may or may not matter to us, but it's from 2013. Now, that feels fairly recent. And for a lot of research papers, I think I would consider that fairly recent. But this is dealing with something in digital technology. And there's a part of me that wonders whether actually I'm questioning the reliability of this now, because so much changes in this world. We know this. Apps are being produced every day. And I wonder if I was actually going to be trying to do something significant based on this, I might want to look for something really recent. And that's something that I'd wonder about. So I'm not just going to take this at face value. It's probably what I expected to come out of it. I'd probably want to have a little look around if I wanted to be making any strong statements. It's focused on Apple apps. It's focused on English speaking. So again, dependent on the context that I'm sitting in, maybe that makes it more reliable, or maybe it's not quite so relevant to me, depending on that. So, okay. Given that I've just said maybe for me it's not the most reliable source, if it feels a little bit dated, what are the implications? Can I take any implications from something that I'm not necessarily sure is reliable at this point? Well, actually, I think the answer is yes, I can. And again, this is why I've included this particular one, because just because something doesn't feel like maybe it's the absolute answer to something doesn't mean I can't take a useful thing from it. And in this case, it's more of a general point. It's a point of reflection, perhaps. It's if we recognize that actually a lot of these apps are doing something that's very specific, they're doing drill and practice, we can probably understand why they're doing that. It's the easiest to program in, it's the easiest to plan for, and the quickest to produce, that sort of thing. If they're doing that, what are we doing as teachers to recommend certain apps for certain purposes to parents, to students, and to other teachers? Are we acknowledging that that's usually what we're getting when we're recommending something? And maybe that's what we want, in which case, are we recommending it deliberately for that purpose? And maybe it's not what we want, and did we realize that? So it's perhaps a slightly more ambiguous implication, but it's more of a, did we think hard enough about this? Could we think more? If we're going to recommend something, let's give it the time to really think about how it's dealing with things. Now, this particular question then, in the Espresso, became this infographic. So this particular paper didn't just report numerical data. It talked about a model for designing digital learning resources. And so you'll notice on the left-hand side, we've got the drill and practice, which they categorize as instructive, where it's a predetermined task, single response required, those type of things. And at the other end, they position things they call constructive, where it's more open-ended and people engaging with it are actually having to construct content, digital artifacts. They're actually having to really actively engage with what they're looking at. And in the middle, we've got something they called manipulable. And you might like to think about what might come under those categories. And you might like to read a little bit more, in which case I would urge you to go and read that particular Espresso, which is focused on remote learning. Now, moving on slightly from Espresso, and I am appreciating that I'm doing a little bit of a whirlwind tour here, so I apologize for the speed, but I do want to say lots of things that I think you'd like to look at. Espresso is no longer the only thing that we are putting out there. We've got something new that we're trialing at the moment, and this is what I'd like to spend a bit of time on now. So this is the next thing we're looking at, is the instant. So we are continuing the idea of thinking about things over coffee. And this is a similar type of document in the sense that it's designed for teachers. It is designed to be 2 pages only, so that it's a very familiar format, distilling everything into as shorter space as possible so that things can be picked up and read easily. But the difference here is this is offering a slightly different flavor. The Espresso is doing something very deliberate in terms of bringing the research to the fore, but in a way that is perhaps more accessible and more digestible. The instant is grounded in that research, but it is actually bringing the classroom practice to the fore. So it's much more focused on what's happening in the classroom around particular concepts or ideas. And it's thinking about how those things are developed over time. So it's not taking a snapshot and saying, fractions in year 1, this is what it looks like. It's actually taking the whole of the concept and trying to say something meaningful about the story from start to finish. What happens when people first meet that idea? What happens as they move on? Where are they headed? So it's a little bit about that sort of horizon content knowledge, thinking about where things are coming from, where they're going, and trying to communicate a bit of that story. Now, because these are new, I'm going to show you a little bit of the format of them in a little bit more detail than the Espresso, because they are, like I say, they are under design, they are new, we're excited about them. And there's lots of things that you will never have seen before because they're not already out there. So, as I said, there are 2 pages. This is the first page, and they are focused on a particular concept or idea. So this one is exploring fraction equivalence. And the circles that you will see, the 3, are the really important key feature here. This is what takes us a long time to actually decide upon. And it's part of this whole synthesis of the research idea again. We've done all this work in a particular topic area. We've done all of that investigating what's out there, trying to pick it apart. This is the top of us distilling everything and pulling out as much as we can about the biggest messages that are coming through about how that idea is developed. So for fraction equivalence here, we've got very broad, big ideas here. I'm not pretending they're easy to engage with. We've got the idea of looking at pairs of fractions. So this is focused on the idea of comparison. Then we've got moving on to thinking about equivalence and non-equivalence, and moving on to an idea of thinking about proportionality and connecting to other ideas of proportionality. And the text that you'll see on there is a little bit of a story around that. It's offering a little bit more of the detail just to give a sense of where this thing is coming from and where it's going. Now you'll notice we do still flag a key research source. This is because it's really important that it is clear to anyone reading this, this is grounded in research. This isn't us making it up. It is us inferring from research, but we've always started from that research position. And so the research source that you'll find on an instant is only one, and it is one that is a particularly useful read if you as a teacher wanted to investigate one in a little bit more detail. So it's not everything that's been used, but it is one particularly powerful one that had a particularly good message, one that was particularly easy to read in some cases, or particularly prominent in what we were looking at. Now, the second side, you won't be able to see all the detail on this, but don't worry, I'm just going to zoom into a bit in a minute. There are two key features on this side. The first is this central part of the page, and this is focused on classroom dialogue. Now, this is about pulling out some little snapshots of the sorts of things that you might hear in a classroom. These are not intended as ideal best practice. It's not, if you're teaching this well, you'll hear these things. This is what you could hear students saying if they were thinking about these things. And they are starting points for you to go, okay, if I heard that, what would I think? What questions would I need to ask? What would I need to do next? How would I have set that up to make that happen? Do I like what's being said? Do I think it's a good thing or not? They are starting points to trigger that little bit of deeper thought about what's going on. And on the right-hand side, we've got models and tools. You might also like to call these representations. So some of these will be things that are familiar. A lot of them are, number line, for example. Sometimes they are things that are different. Maybe they're surprising. Maybe they are a familiar representation in an unusual place. But they are ones that are flagged within the literature base that we're looking at as being particularly powerful, either for revealing something about that topic or for connecting across topics, because you can actually use the same model again and again and again. Okay, now what I'd like to do is just to take a moment then, as I said, to focus just on one or two pieces of the dialogue, just to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So from the very first box, the first part of this story, looking at pairs of fractions. This is an example of one of the little snippets of dialogue that I was suggesting appeared in that central box. Now you'll see here, I really do mean a little snippet, a sound bite. This is not telling you very much at this point. There's no context. It's not giving you the whole conversation. It's something you might just catch. And so it's no good just to read it and think, I like it or I don't like it, or I've heard that, I haven't heard that. We actually do need to think a little bit more deeply about it. So I've got a couple of questions. The first is actually, who do you think is talking? And what I mean by that is, do you think this is a teacher talking to a student? There's two lines there. Maybe it's the teacher asking the question and the student answering. Do you think it's a student talking to a student? Or do you think it's a teacher talking to a teacher? You know, any combination of people who are in the classroom. Who do you think it is? Now, that's not a question I require an answer to, because there isn't one. But it's a, what's your instinct? If you heard that, what would you be expecting? And that's sometimes interesting. If it is two students, which it could conceivably be, they're having a conversation about something, what more do you want to know? If you've walking around the classroom, you hear this over the other side of the room, it makes you look up and you want to walk over. Why do you want to walk over? What is it you actually want to know? And I imagine there's a lot of things you'd like to know at this point, but think them to yourself explicitly at this point. Given how little we've got here, how little we sometimes hear, how much could you want to know from that? And related to that, what ideas do you think could be being revealed here in what they're saying? Why is it that you're interested? You're interested because your ears have picked up something you think is either revealing something good or something bad, potentially. You've picked up that language, you thought, oh, I want to know more about what they're saying, because they might be showing that they've got this really good idea. It might be showing that they're starting to think in a particular way. But again, just reflect on how little we've got here. And this is often how we do this in the classroom, trying not to make assumptions, but just questioning, what is it we think is happening? And then we go over and we do find out more. We can't do it based on this alone. I've got one more prompting question, because I think this is the thing that actually triggers in my mind when I read these little sound bites, as it were. I'm thinking, what would I see if I went over there? What would actually be on the desk if I'm a visitor to this classroom and I've heard this? So I don't actually know very much about what's going on. What might I see? Is there equipment that they're using? Is that my go-to here? Are there images? Is there something they've drawn on the desks, on the tables? Are they working with particular things? Is there something I'd like to see if I went over? And that's quite good as well. Just thinking really broadly about what we're seeing, what we're hearing, why it's linked to that story that we're telling, and which models and tools might be being brought in here in a good way or a bad way, and how we could think about that. Now, I would quite like to spend some more time looking at these, but I'm going to have to leave it at that point because I'm very conscious of time, and sort of leave it as a real taster, and hope that when I share how you can get access to this, you will go and have a little look for yourself and spend some time really reading through these. So I'm just going to whiz through the next couple of slides because I wasn't sure how quickly I'd be able to make my way through these. So I was going to talk about this one. I'm just going to leave it there long enough so you can glance at it and just get a taster. And I was going to talk about this one. So I was going to give you a little snippet from each of the 3-part story. And like I say, hopefully I've just shown you enough that you go, hang on, I want to read that more. So how can you read more of this? How can you find out more about what we're doing, about what might be useful to you? Now, the instants in particular are only available through our new website that is called Journey Maths. This is something that is under design. It is not a polished website that we're going, here you go, here's the answer to everything, beautiful space for you to go and use. This is actually a piece of research in itself. So for you to get access to this is actually an opportunity for you to get involved in a little bit of, or get closer to a bit of educational research yourselves. So there's a lot of things going on here that might be of interest to you. So what can you find when you go on to Journey Maths? In this website, there are resources. So that's why I've spent the time talking to you about the Espresso today. You will find some of the Espressos there. They exist as a library on our main website, which is the link that was shared earlier. But some of them will also appear here and you will see them and you'll go, ah, yes, I know that thing. The instant sits alongside them. And there's also another resource, again, just to sort of pique your interest here, called a percolation. And this again is something a little bit different. This one is the big one. This one's the detail, the thing that's going to take a bit longer to get engaged with. We've called it the all you can drink. So this one's a slightly different resource. And you will see if you choose to go and explore this website that that's got a different flavor to it again. And you may or may not like that. Now, super quickly, what we've got on the Journey Maths website is topics that are dealt with by looking at these 3 resources. We've got a collection of topics, and in this trial design phase, we've got 6 topics within a collection, and we've got 1 collection available to explore. And the focus here is about looking at these different resources, different resource types, and the connections between the topics within that little collection. And in the future, as we move forward, what we're hoping to do is to publish more and more of these collections to essentially populate a map of mathematics. So the first collection that is available to you, that is on this website now, is focused on the idea of proportion and multiplicative relationships. So when I said I was collecting together topics, they are collected because they've got something in common. They're not just a random selection. They're collected in a different way, in an unusual way sometimes. This is a particularly common theme in Maths Ed at the moment, And it's a really powerful way of drawing some connections between some sometimes disparate topics in the curriculum. So that's what we've chosen to focus on first. So you'll have an opportunity to dig into the detail of what that means for us and how that comes out in certain topics by looking at espressos, instant, percolations if you wish, and some other bits and pieces that sit around this within this Journey Maths site. So to come to a conclusion here, because I need to, how can you actually get access to it? So this is the most important page. If you put this link into your browser, it will take you to a survey. Equally, if you've got your phone and you scan that QR code, it will also take you to the same survey. It's a very short survey, but it's so that we have your information, because if you are going to get access to the site, you're actually part of our initial phase, our pilot study, as it were. We will want to be getting some feedback on how you're using it and the sorts of things that you're doing. So completing that sends a message to our researcher, who will then get in touch with you individually to give you access to the site and the resources. And I really hope that you want to do that. I'm going to whiz through to the final slide just so that I've summarized everything, but I will make sure that any links are shared. So other things that might be useful to remember: the Cambridge Maths website is here again. That's where you'll find the Espressos, it's where you'll find blogs, and you'll also find some research documentation and general information about Cambridge Maths. We have a presence on Twitter, so if you are active on Twitter as well, please follow us, see what's going on there as well. And finally, if you want a complete picture of what we're doing, sign up to our newsletter through the website, and you'll get updates on when we publish new blogs, when new Espressos are out, when new features on Journey Maths are coming out, and anything else that we're doing. So if you would like to know a bit more, these are some ways that you can do that. Now, I think I need to wrap up. So I will now stop talking. I'll make sure any links that are needed are popped in the chat. Thank you very much.